Nighttime on Still Waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. 20th of May, Tuesday. The yellow flag are out, unfolding the origami of their petals from the squashed chrysalis of their buds. Yellow iris arrives flat-packed, to be assembled without sound, held only by a dance of air and light. The sharp smell of petrichor, damp earth and vegetation that have lain in the sun for days, and a night that swims with a swirl of scents and a freshness that only spring rain can bring. The moon will not rise for another hour or two, and so, with the owl, we must make do with starlight and the gentle rustling of rush and sedge. And this is the narrowboat Erica, narrowcasting into the fragrant darkness of a night in May, to you, wherever you are. Welcome. I'm so pleased you're here. I was hoping you'd make it. I don't think rain is on the cards tonight, but from time to time the skies do look brooding. So why not come inside? The kettle is on the boil, the biscuit barrel has been restocked, and welcome aboard. Almost overnight, the familiar light and colours along the towpath seem to have changed. Gone that thickening of the early spring haze of greens, covering the scrubby patches of bare earth, turning brown to the livid flush of new-growth green, studded with the coloured palette of jewelled petals, the harbingers of late spring and early summer. And gone are the long, airy, sweeping vistas of the first grass growth, the young rush and sedges that fringe the clean lines of the canal's edge. Now, on each side of the towpath, the great move sunward has begun. Up the ash tree climbs the ivy, up the ivy climbs the sun. With a 20,000 pattering has a valley breeze begun. Feathery ash, neglected elder, shift the shade and make it run. So wrote John Betjeman for the beginning of his poem Upper Lambourne. But it's not just the ivy that climbs with the sunshine. Nettle, cow parsley, sorrels, hogweed, reed, rush, sedge, flag and hemlock are chest high and higher. Mats of goosegrass and bramble, ivy and vetch weave and sinuously climb with it. Climbing, clambering, higher and higher. Onwards and upwards is the great unheard cry. Raise our hands and heads to heaven. The sun, the sky, the light. And now, in places, the canal is entirely screened from me. And where just a week before I could watch the couple of duck pairs and the trio of unpaired drakes, I can no longer even see the canal. A thick, tangled wall of nettle, bramble, blackthorn, and a few beech and hazel saplings totally block my view. And on the other side of the towpath, traveller's joy, bramble and nettles grow in profusion, great billowing green clouds of exuberant life. Each day perceptibly growing higher and higher, and the path grows narrower, literally hedged in by growth, a growth that now in places is head high. Maggie and I now walk in a world unfamiliar to us. She can still hunt out her favourite places to sniff and catch the news, but it entails snuffling through and sometimes into the hedge growth. I am more disadvantaged. I can guess where the rabbit holes and badger scrapes are, where the tunnels under the wire fencing are, but it is a guess. Later, the tunnels will become more visible, but now it's sort of disorienting. I have known this stretch of path on and off for around 5 years. I could certainly make a good fist of walking it blindfold by the feel of the path and the shifts in scent. In fact, in the blind of night, I have done just that, but nevertheless I'm taken by surprise. I had forgotten it could feel so dark, so enclosed down here, even at the height of the daylight. But I find my sense of shock and disorientation rather hopeful. I'm glad that this little stretch of scrubby towpath can still grab me by the neck and make me pause with surprise and wonder. And I find Miles Hadfield's descriptions of how May is experienced in post-war England so charmingly spot on. In 1950, he wrote, "In a very mild way, the old custom of going a-Maying lingers, but at weekends, instead of on the first of the month, when fine days take townspeople out into the edge of the country. On Sunday evenings, the roads are full of motorists and cyclists, the trains and buses of hikers, all returning tired from their outings. Nearly all carry huge bunches of bluebells, which are stuffed into bowls and vases on the tables of their smoky homes and central heated offices, as a reminder of fresher air and a brighter outlook." The language may change, and perhaps the routes of access, but the spirit and the heart remain the same. And particularly at the weekends, long trails of walkers stride purposefully, each alone in their heads, or amble and chatter caught in bubbles of conversation. And then there are the cyclists that whir and zizz in colourful gnat threads, sweeping and swerving like swifts on the wing around the rambler and the ambler, the twitcher, the forager, the botanist and mycologist, the hiker and the biker and the little families geocaching and squirreling in the undergrowth, and the joggers, the plodders, the vloggers, the bloggers, the expert, the leader, the Instagram feeder, those taking their dogs for a walk and those being taken for a walk by their dog, the couples, the lonely, the families, the solitaries, the ones who have come to forget, the ones who have come to remember. They're all here, and they're all welcome. My home is their home too. This is where we belong, even if some don't quite know it yet, or recognize their names in the shimmer of birdsong and light. And like the flowers around, they too have their season. Their first blooming, when the towpaths are still tacky and the sun can't quite chase away the chill. And then the flourishing, and then the colourful diminishing, gradual, to the slow, quiet months, when the towpath seems to breathe easier and sleep a while. But for now, we'll pause and let them pass on by. There's enough here for everyone to drink their fill. And like swallows, they're gone. A flash of motion and colour that somehow, in some way, has served to make this day the richer. And the young drake mallard gives his tail a wag and then closes his eye and drifts in the sun. I apologise that if tonight all sounds a little chaotic and rough around the edges, I'm having to record this a bit out of time and things have got a bit jumbled. This is one of the busiest times at work, and it's particularly busy this year. And we're also away at the Crick Boat Show at the weekend, when I would normally have recorded this episode and had a little bit more time. We're both really looking forward to it again this year, going to Crick. It's arguably one of the largest of the shows that's exclusively dedicated to the canals and inland waterways boating. But actually, by the time this goes out, we should, if all goes to plan, be back on the boat. But I'm having to do everything somewhat in advance. I had a lovely email from Richard Griffin. Thank you so much, Richard. And I'm glad that you've been finding the readings from Mum's Journal fascinating. And Richard went on to write, just heard how your parents sailed to Canada. This sort of oral history is fabulous. Thank you for bringing it to a wider audience. Well, thank you. And yes, you're absolutely right. This type of history, from a very personal and ground level perspective, is so important and can so easily get lost amid the big meta stories of history. And when I was reading your words, I'm sure Mum would have absolutely loved that, because it reminded me that she was a big supporter and advocate of the Mass Observation Project, which was started in 1937. And it sought, I think it was 500 volunteers to keep a record or a diary of their daily lives. It was initiated by anthropologist Tom Harrison, a poet Charles Madge, and the filmmaker Humphrey Jennings. And the aim was to create a social record of British life, focusing on everyday experiences and from their perspectives. It ran actually until 1950s, and I think it's actually been restarted fairly recently. As a slightly frustrated sociologist, Mum loved this type of thing, and her journals certainly reflect this desire to capture the details that can often be swept away with the dusters of later histories. And Mindshambles and Anna McKellar both commented on that last episode. Anna's parents also emigrated to Canada around this time too, and they then moved later on down to Florida. They seem to have had a much more fortunate experience there. And Anna wrote that, "A story has made me wish many times that my parents were still alive to ask questions." And Mum's journal aside, I too feel that acutely, Anna. Whilst I grew up with most of these stories, and in much later life have read Mum's accounts before, that familiarity can sometimes mean that you just accept the whole thing as normal and natural. And it's only as various listeners have contacted me over the past 4 episodes to express their admiration or note how courageous this step was before the internet and Google Maps and all the modern accoutrements that travellers tend to take for granted, has it really sunk in, how brave they were and what a massive step this must have been. And let's face it, the shock of the Titanic was still relatively fresh, and for them would have been the equivalent of having occurred in 1980 for us. These things really only struck home when I was reading it this time. So, like Anna, I too have so many questions now that I wish I could ask. And Mindshambles wrote saying that it's sad that their Canadian dream was not realised, though already the next chapter seems to tease different adventures that are just as beguiling. I think it was those next chapters that became so instrumental in forming them into the people that I knew and grew up with. If they had stayed, they would have grown to be 2 very different people, and no doubt would have loved it and embraced it with open arms. However, yes, I think it's the next stages of their life that suited them far better, and it was there that they began to lay down the pattern and the values for how they would live out the rest of their lives. And hello and thank you all the way over to Australia to Tanya Yorge for your comments, Tanya, and I'm really glad that you also were enjoying Mum's account. And yes, it is amazing when life seems to turn on chance decisions and strokes of fate. And also thank you for your comment on the Orion Still Looks Down episode. I'm really glad that you have found it helpful. For some reason, I've had quite a few comments about that particular one. It seems to ring certain bells or chime certain resonances with people. And I had a lovely email from Lee, who wrote to tell me about a wonderful wildlife encounter that she had. Lee lives in a cabin high, or at least high by UK standards, in the Colorado mountains. And she wrote, I was eating dinner, sitting at my kitchen table right next to a large window. Several deer came through, slowly grazing on the spring grass as they've been doing most evenings. This evening, though, they seemed unusually curious about me, looking at me with great interest through the window. One was so curious that he touched his nose to the screen several times, looking at me as I sat about 1.5 feet away. I looked back into his big brown eyes and was mesmerized. Then he calmly strolled on and resumed his grazing. I can't help feeling that something important beyond words was shared in that moment. Maybe just the knowledge that we all share this awesome natural world together. They say that where there are deer, there are mountain lions, so you should haze them out of your yard. But I can't do that. It is I who am living in their ever-shrinking territories, not the other way round. The other afternoon, I wanted to go out to get something from my little shed in the woods, but there were about 8 of them, bedded down under the trees right outside my door. They were resting so peacefully, chewing their cud, and in one case deep in sleep on his side. I waited several hours before venturing outside to the shed, which inevitably interrupted their siestas. They were back within the hour, secure in the knowledge that they were safe on my property. However, just a few hours later, Lee did write back to say that her yard camera had picked up a mountain lion prowling around her property. And talking of lovely emails, it was great to hear from Gabriella. Gabriella, I am really glad that you've been enjoying hearing the extracts from Mum's journals, and thank you so much for talking me through the pronunciation of your name. And Gabriella also wrote about her recent experience of the power outage in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which lasted for 8 days. The amazing part of it, as she says, was that it was caused by a 15-minute storm. We certainly are beginning to encounter some very turbulent weather. And also thank you to Judy from Boston for sending me the link to Persephone Books on the book on canal life. I have to say, Judy, I really love that Evan Charlton painting, Canal Girls. It's so wonderfully evocative. And it sort of reminds me of Drew Marland's paintings too. So thank you. And I just want to say a quick belated hello and thank you over on YouTube. Thank you, Rebecca Cook, for your lovely comment. It's always really lovely to hear about how people find this podcast, and I'm really glad that you have found it and that you're here. And finally, I want to welcome a new Lockwheeler, Susan Baker. It's lovely to have you aboard, Susan, and I'm delighted to hear that the podcast is now part of your fortnightly Sunday night schedule. So thank you so much. And a thank you to all of our Lockwheelers for supporting this podcast. They are Susan Baker, Mindshambles, Claire Hollingsworth, Gabriella Marie Rodriguez Vinot, Kevin B., Fleur and David McLaughlin, Lois Raphael, Tanya Yorgay, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hines, David Dirham, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Alison on the narrowboat Mucker, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holtzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, Narrowboat Precious Jet, Linda Reynolds Birkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. One of the things that most people who knew Mum remembered her for was for her seeming never-ending supply of scones. Now, I probably need to pause at this point, being aware of the sharp intake of breath just now. I am fully aware of the controversy concerning the pronunciation of scone or scone. And you may be right by pointing out that I am being entirely inconsistent. I do always refer to pine cones as pine cones and not pine cons. However, in my defence, I do always say the last one has gone and not the last one has gone. And I guess if we're going to get all purist on this, I always say the dishes are done, but would never dream of the dishes of done. So, at this point, I will note that there is a level of disagreement. No, let's call it a glorious range of expressions for the pronunciation of scone or scone, and that from what I have found from reading various articles on it, in the US, scones tends largely to be the preferred term, while in Britain it tends to be scone. However, I also recognise that even here there are regional differences. For example, here in the Midlands, rather ironically, scone seems to be the preferred way of pronouncing it. Nevertheless, scone is how Mum pronounced it. It's how I was brought up to say it, so I'm gonna stick with it. Now, what I was trying to say was that one of the things that most people who knew Mum remembered her for was her seemingly never-ending supply of scones, and the coffee and the chat that went along with them. Although she was probably the most sociable and socially outward-looking person in our family, she absolutely loved meeting people and chatting. She was the type of woman who would board a bus, sit down, and then engage in conversation with an absolute and total stranger 4 or 5 rows back. For an introverted, socially awkward and acutely shy 10-year-old, this was the most excruciating experience in my youth. I would squirm and try and sink down into my seat, my neck retracting into my shirt collar like a tortoise, while shouted comments bounced back and forth over the heads of the silent and glum passengers in between. Barry and the Fens, who drove that route at that time in those very same buses, in all probability would have overheard some of those conversations. As far as I was concerned, much to my mortification, the entire world could hear them. So that was the type of woman my mother was. However, strange to say, one of the things Mum hated with a vengeance, almost to the point of morbidity, was entertaining. And I have to say, it's also something that I share with her. Drop in for coffee or tea or stay into the night chatting, I'm fine with. But the thought of having to sit down with dining plates and forks and knives and chit-chat over the hors d'oeuvres sends me quivering into such a frenzy of sweaty panic and dread that some only associate with the sounding of the last trump and the final reckoning. Actually, it's one of the things that I find a little surprising when I read Mum's journals, and she refers to enjoying entertaining and being entertained by friends. It just doesn't quite equate with the Mum that I know. And it's possibly from their time in the caravans. And certainly by the time they were living on the Cathay, hospitality was much more relaxed and focused more on friends dropping in for a cuppa and a bite to eat. Throwing dinner parties on a boat is just not feasible. And even today, probably a bankside barbecue is the closest that you'll get. And for them, just as importantly, friends, relations and acquaintances didn't expect anything more than to perch on the edge of a bunk with a mug of tea and chat. And Mum relished that knowledge that they hadn't arrived trudging over muddy farm fields out of a sense of obligation or the piquant promise of some exotic menu. They'd come because they'd wanted to come. No compulsion, no sense of social duty. And what is more, they came with few expectations beyond a nice cuppa and company. And they were welcomed and accepted precisely on those terms. It's what she loved most. The informality of putting on the kettle in the Cathy's little galley, chatting while it boiled. Laughter, perhaps sympathy, while she quickly threw together some drop scones. Why spoil a lovely evening with friends or those who will become friends with all the unnecessary stress and bother of formality and all the prescribed etiquette that goes along with it, Mum felt. Later on, when Dad got into making his own wine and homebrew, and the scent of hops still sends me reeling back to the kitchen of my childhood, this pattern continued. Mornings, Mum would ply friends and neighbours with coffee and scones, while in the evening it was a drop of homebrew or let's see if the old parsnip has cleared any. Dad's homebrew was locally renowned for its potency. And it was only in much later life that I realised that proper antiphonal response to cheers, the first quaff, was not actually, "Oh, this is strong." And on more than one occasion, neighbours who were seasoned drinkers and who were by now almost inured to the effects of draft beer at the local, on leaving our house could be seen merrily staggering up the street, praising the virtues of Dad's homebrew. And what's more, a coffee or an evening with homebrew beer and wine never really necessitated that convention of reciprocation that a formal evening meal seemed to require. Beyond, of course, the usual, "Oh, you really must drop in on us sometime too." And it wasn't because Mum and Dad didn't like going out. They both just fiercely resisted this sense of obligation placed either on them or on others. Later in life, when they'd moved into a new area and the house formed part of a cul-de-sac of other new builds, all the residents within this small cul-de-sac had quite a lot in common and quickly formed a very supportive and friendly group, helping each other out, etc. And it wasn't too long before, that in the nature of these things, that invitation to dinners started to be sent. And as is also the nature of recently retired professionals, informal notional rotas began to be drawn up in people's minds about when and who will be hosting future dinners. Mum and Dad, but Mum particularly, unsurprisingly hated this type of thing. And it wasn't helped by Mum having developed a ferocious allergy to onions and any food with essential oils in it, which blistered her skin so that her arms and face looked as if they'd been severely burnt. However, they both felt really trapped by this. And I can't remember whose idea it was. I think it was Mum's, to suggest when her time came, rather than host yet another dinner party, yawn, oh, how many more can we have? Why not everyone all come around to ours for breakfast? But fortunately, everyone agreed, and it apparently was a huge success, and everyone commented on how much more relaxed it all was than the dinner parties. After that, it was agreed that it would be far nicer and easier just to drop into my parents from time to time for coffee and scones, which they regularly did. But that was Mum. Even as a child, I was used to Mum's friends dropping in for elevensies. To keep costs down, she started to make scones, which quickly gained fame near and far. So much so that I was aware that when Donna and I started to seriously date, that she felt under a huge pressure to try and make some scones for herself, and it almost became, for her, a rather nerve-wracking rite of passage when she dropped by one weekend for elevensies with her own batch of scones, which gained Mum's seal of approval as far as scone production and also girlfriend material. Looking back, I can now begin to see how much that informal but warm-hearted attitude to hospitality and that sense of open-handedness to those around has influenced my view on life. The sense of creating a welcoming space, a place to chat, laugh, to, in Mum's words, put the world to rights. Oh, and boy, did she ever do that. And there were times during my school holidays I would join them when I heard the biscuit tin being opened, and I would listen to the ping-pong of conversation, news, ideas, views, being batted back and forth over the net of my head. Conversation swung from how old Bill's doing after his operation. Not so good, I'm afraid. One of my aunts had something very similar, and she died. Did she really? Oh, it was so tragic, really. She only had one leg after all. No, poor soul. And I would reach out, a hand toward the biscuits, and then it would move to how the tomatoes seemed to be so much slower this year, and then jump to what the government was doing wrong, and then suddenly switch like a flea jumping on a hound dog's back to the price of coley in the local fishmongers and how it has shot up, and did you hear about poor old Dr. Dyer? And my fidgeting would catch someone's eye, and then conversation would turn to what are they teaching in school today? And my ears would burn red. Conversations whose significance was held in their inconsequentiality. That was Mum's genius. Her ability to create a small space in a busy world, to share company without any thought of reciprocation. They take us as they find us, dear, she would say. If they think the carpets need vacuuming or the stair banister dusting, too bad. This is our home, which we love, and we welcome them into its heart, in all its rather chaotic, unkempt, and slightly threadbare reality. Mum spent her life creating a home, not an exhibit to be marvelled at. And I'm fortunate in that Donna lives by a very similar philosophy. And actually that, when I come to think about it, that is the total epitome of this podcast. A space where you and I can share some time over a cup of tea or coffee or something else. It's not going to change the world, but it might make it a little more bearable, a little more understandable perhaps, a little warmer, a little less lonely. Times of no expectation. No need to dress up to be people that are not quite you. To just be welcomed as you stand, as you are. And most of all, with no expectation of reciprocation or expectation of return. How radical and subversive is that? And, it's only just struck me that nighttime on still waters is really nothing more and nothing less than my version of Mum's elevensies, minus the scones or scones, unfortunately. I think it's because of all these associations and resonances that I was struck so forcibly and touched so deeply by Mindshambles' poem that he recently sent to me, and in particular the title, Erica's Place. You know, I think Mum would have loved that. And what a great title for these podcasts, Erica's Place. Her philosophy of life runs deep. A place of welcome, a place of company, a place of meetings of minds, but also of hearts, with no sense of obligation or expectation. You are here because you've been invited, and I want you to be here and to feel at ease. But you are here also because you want to be, and nothing more is required. Welcome to Erica's Place. Erica's Place by Mindshambles. Living feet from the meandering flow, carrying wise old swans and mischievous ducks, past weathered mooring ropes. Lines of gently swaying trees stood smartly for inspection, and off round the bend smoke rises from the stubby metal chimney, pausing to flit about, briefly, before chasing the current amid fallen leaves and dandelion clocks. A soft putting sound wafts on the breeze from somewhere roundabouts, a hint of summer birdsong, mingling with the whistle of the old kettle, dances through the towpath dapple shade. All is well. This place, holding back the flickering modernity, full of angst, anger, ambivalence, clamouring for attention, but not here. Here, just for this moment, all is lost to the current, as we sit, moored steady, warm cup in hand. Thank you, Mindshambles. And remember, you're always welcome at Erica's Place. And with that, this is the Narrowboat Erica, signing off for the night and wishing you a very restful and peaceful night. Good night. Temperature, outside 15 degrees, inside 23 degrees, humidity 54%, dew point 4 degrees, wind direction north-northeast, wind strength 8 miles per hour, barometric pressure 1017.3 rising, cloud cover 76%, cloud ceiling 1,500 feet, precipitation 1.78 millimeters, moon phase 34.8% waning crescent, day length 16 hours 2 minutes, sunset 21:05, sky casting 5:02.